The Hells Angels biker watched the little girl lift a dusty box under a sink, and the secret inside rewired his past. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. In a small town nestled on the outskirts of a sprawling desert, a man known as Reaper rode through the empty streets on his Harley-Davidson. His jacket, adorned with the Hells Angels patch, was a symbol of strength, fear, and a past that weighed heavy on his soul. He'd been on the road for hours, the roar of his bike filling the silence of the night. But something about this town felt different. As he cruised down the familiar, quiet streets, a faint sound reached his ears, a sound that caught his attention like a whisper in the wind. A soft rustling, almost like someone moving things around in a hurry. He slowed his bike, the engine humming as he turned onto a narrow side street, and parked near an old, dilapidated house. The porch light flickered, and through the cracked window, he saw a small figure, barely visible, scrambling near the sink. He didn't know why, but something compelled him to approach. Perhaps it was the eerie silence that enveloped the town, or maybe it was the sheer vulnerability of the girl that stirred something deep inside him. As he stepped off his bike and approached the house, he noticed the girl, no older than 10, struggling with an old, dusty box under the sink. Her small hands were shaking as she tried to lift it, and the box seemed to resist her every move. Reaper's instinct was to leave, to stay out of whatever was unfolding here, but his legs moved before his mind could process. He knocked on the door, and after a moment, it creaked open. The girl, startled, looked up, her big brown eyes wide with a mix of fear and curiosity. She had dirt smudges on her cheeks, her hair tangled from what looked like days without a proper comb. "Can I help?" Reaper's voice was gruff, yet there was a softness in his tone that didn't belong to a man like him. The girl hesitated, glancing between him and the box. She didn't trust easily, especially not someone like him. But there was something in his presence, something different about the way he stood there, his gaze not menacing but genuinely concerned. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. I can't get it out," she murmured. Reaper stepped forward, crouching down next to her. The smell of dust and old wood filled the air as he carefully reached under the sink and grabbed the box. It was heavier than he expected, its surface scratched and worn. As he pulled it free, he noticed a strange, faded symbol etched into the side, one that seemed oddly familiar. He set the box on the counter, and the girl stepped back, her eyes never leaving it. Reaper opened it slowly, the lid creaking. Inside was a collection of old photographs, yellowed with age, and a faded leather wallet. But it was one photograph in particular that made his breath catch. A young man, barely 20, smiling alongside a group of bikers. He was wearing a Hells Angels vest. His face, it was Reaper himself. A younger version, one he barely recognized. His heart skipped a beat as memories flooded back, memories he had buried long ago. This was no accident. This wasn't just a forgotten box under a sink. This was a sign, something that tied him back to a past he thought he'd left behind. The girl stared at him, waiting for him to say something. Reaper didn't speak for a long moment. Instead, he picked up the photograph, his hands trembling ever so slightly. His past had just resurfaced in the most unexpected way, and he realized that the secret inside this box would change everything, reworking the fabric of his past, unraveling truths he had long since hidden from himself. He couldn't walk away from this. Not now. Not when he knew what this discovery meant. The girl's voice broke through his thoughts. "What is it?" she asked, her voice trembling with curiosity. Reaper looked at her, then back at the photograph. "A piece of my past," he whispered, his mind racing. "A past I never wanted to remember. But it looks like it's found me again." The box sat there on the counter, its presence somehow heavier than its physical weight. Reaper stared at the photograph, his fingers tracing the faded edges of the image. The man in the picture was him, but it felt like a stranger. It was a version of him from a past he had long buried, a past he had thought was far behind him. The girl stood next to him, her small hands still clutching the edge of the counter, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Who is that?" she asked quietly. Reaper glanced at her, his throat tightening for a moment. That's me, he muttered. The girl didn't say anything at first, clearly confused. That's you, she repeated, still not quite understanding. He nodded slowly, setting the photo back in the box. A long time ago, I used to be someone else. The words hung in the air like a confession he wasn't entirely ready to admit. He could feel the weight of his past pressing against him, the memories that had been locked away for so long now creeping back, threatening to break the surface. The sound of the wind howling outside filled the silence between them. Reaper stood up, rubbing his face with his hand. I need to think, he said, more to himself than to her. The girl watched him, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, but not quite sure how to respond. She had no idea what the photograph meant, but she could tell that it had shaken him in a way that made her uneasy. What's in the wallet? She asked, her voice quiet, but persistent. Reaper's gaze flicked back to the box. He hadn't even looked at the wallet yet, too focused on the photograph. The box was filled with old memories, things from a time he had long tried to forget. But now, it felt like they were coming back to find him, one piece at a time. He hesitated for a moment before pulling the wallet from the box. It was worn, the leather cracked and faded, as if it had been carried through years of life on the road. He opened it carefully, his heart racing. Inside, there were more photographs, some of the faces he recognized, others were unfamiliar. There was a small folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. Reaper unfolded it, his eyes scanning. The words. His breath caught in his throat as the words hit him. We need to talk. I know what you've been hiding. It's time to come clean. The note wasn't signed, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was a message from someone he had known long ago, someone who had been part of his past. Someone who had seen things he thought he had left behind. His mind raced as the memories flooded back. The Hell's Angels, the brotherhood he had once been a part of, the violence, the chaos, the things they had done that couldn't be undone. He had tried to leave it all behind, to start fresh, but the past had a way of finding you, no matter how far you ran. Who wrote that? The girl asked, her voice cutting through his thoughts. Reaper didn't answer right away. He folded the note and placed it back in the wallet, his fingers trembling slightly. He didn't know if he was ready to confront whatever this was, but he knew he couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. It's someone I used to know, he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. The girl didn't press him further, sensing the weight of the moment. What do you think it means? She asked, her eyes searching his face for answers. Reaper turned away from her, his gaze focused on the window, where the last light of day was fading. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever was in that box, whatever was in that wallet, was going to change everything. The past he had tried so hard to escape had caught up with him, and he had no choice but to face it. The girl stayed silent, watching him. She didn't understand everything, but she could feel the tension, the shift in the air. Reaper turned back to her, his eyes hardening. You need to stay away from this, he said, his voice stern. This is not a game. It's dangerous. She looked at him, the seriousness in his voice sinking in. I won't get in your way, she said softly. But if you need help, I'm here. Reaper felt something inside him stir, a feeling he hadn't had in years. A sense of connection, of responsibility. He nodded slowly, his gaze softening. I know, he said, and I'll remember that. He turned back to the box, his mind already racing through the possibilities, the dangerous road ahead of him. The past had been buried for a reason, but now it was resurfacing, and there was no turning back. Reaper's mind was racing as he sat in the dimly lit room, the box still sitting open on the counter. He had never intended for his past to resurface, but now, it was impossible to ignore. The note in the wallet, the photograph of a younger version of himself, it all pointed to something much larger than he had ever anticipated. He stared out the window, the cold wind rattling the glass as the last remnants of daylight faded into the night. The girl, still standing by the counter, watched him carefully, her curiosity still lingering, but now with a sense of concern. What's going on, mister? She asked quietly, her small voice breaking the silence. Reaper sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. He had no answers for her, not yet. I don't know, he admitted. But whatever this is, it's not good. He stood up abruptly, walking over to the window, his hands resting on the edge of the sill as he stared into the darkening streets outside. His mind was still processing the note. The message was clear. Someone knew who he was, knew what he had done, and was calling him back to face it all. I thought I left all of this behind, he muttered to himself. I really thought it was over. The girl remained silent, sensing the gravity of the moment. After a few moments, she hesitated before speaking up again. Are you going to do something about it? Reaper turned slowly to face her, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? He asked, the edge in his voice softened by her innocence. I mean, are you going to find out what's in the letter? What the note means? She was right. He had been so focused on running from his past, he hadn't stopped to consider what this new development meant. He wasn't sure he was ready to dig any deeper, but something inside him told him he had no choice. I don't know if I can, he said honestly. The girl stepped forward, her small frame surprisingly steady as she looked him in the eyes. But you're strong, right? She asked, her voice filled with a quiet conviction. You've faced hard things before. You can handle this. Reaper's gaze softened slightly. He hadn't realized how much he needed to hear that until now. He had always considered himself someone who could handle anything. Until now. Now, everything felt different. The weight of his past had come back with a vengeance, and he wasn't sure he had the strength to confront it. But as he looked at the girl standing in front of him, something shifted. Maybe she was right. Maybe this was the fight he needed to face. Reaper took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. He had lived through the chaos, the blood, the violence of his past life as a Hell's Angels enforcer. But this was different. This wasn't about protecting his brothers or riding on the open road. This was personal. All right, he said, his voice firm now. I'll find out who's behind this. The girl smiled, a small but genuine expression of relief. She had no idea what he was about to get into, but something about him made her believe in his resolve. Be careful, she warned him, her voice barely above a whisper. You don't know who you're dealing with. Reaper nodded, his expression hardening as he picked up the wallet and the note again. He knew she was right. The past was never really behind him. It was always lurking, waiting for the right moment to resurface. And now that moment had come. He couldn't back down now. The past had a hold on him, and he would either face it head-on or let it consume him. He turned toward the door, his boots thudding on the wooden floor. Stay inside, he told the girl, his tone softer now. It's not safe out there. She nodded, but there was a look in her eyes that told him she didn't believe she was in danger. Reaper didn't have time to explain further. He had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let anyone else get hurt because of his mistakes. He stepped out into the night, the cold air biting at his skin as he made his way toward his bike. The street was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound seem amplified. Reaper's fingers brushed the leather of his jacket as he mounted the Harley-Davidson, the familiar rumble of the engine under him. A stark reminder of everything he had left behind. But as he revved the engine and pulled away from the curb, something inside him felt different. It was as if the very act of leaving this place was pulling him back into the life he thought he had escaped. He had no idea who had sent the note, or why they had chosen now to contact him. But one thing was certain. His past was coming for him, and he would have to confront it, whether he was ready or not. As he drove through the quiet streets, the image of the photograph, the words in the note, and the girl's innocent gaze stayed with him. He didn't know how this was going to end, but he knew one thing. He couldn't run anymore. The past had a way of finding you, and now, it was time to face it. Reaper revved the engine of his Harley-Davidson as he sped down the empty streets, the cool night air whipping against his face. His mind was still reeling from the note he had found, the cryptic message that seemed to beckon him back into a life he thought he had escaped. The photograph, the familiar face, the feeling of being pulled into something much larger than himself, it all weighed heavily on his chest. The memories of his days with the Hell's Angels, the chaos, the violence, all of it felt like it was closing in on him again. He had always believed that running from his past would set him free, but now he understood that running only made it worse. It was like trying to outrun a storm. No matter how fast you went, it always seemed to catch up. He turned a corner, his headlights illuminating the dim street as he made his way toward the outskirts of town. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to find the answers. He couldn't afford to ignore this any longer. His thoughts were interrupted by the screech of tires in the distance. He instinctively slowed down, his eyes scanning the darkened streets. Something felt off. He didn't know what, but his instincts told him to be careful. He pulled the bike into a shadowed alley and killed the engine, his senses sharpening. The night was quiet, almost too quiet. It wasn't until he heard the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel that he realized he wasn't alone. Reaper's hand instinctively went to the knife tucked in his boot. He wasn't sure if it was a threat, but the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The footsteps grew closer, and then a figure emerged from the darkness. Reaper's gaze locked on the silhouette. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a leather jacket that looked just like his. The man stopped a few feet away, his eyes hidden under the brim of a worn baseball cap. Reaper didn't move, his eyes never leaving the stranger. The man spoke first, his voice low and gravelly. "I figured you'd show up eventually." Reaper didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure who this man was or what he wanted, but he had a feeling it had something to do with his past. "Who are you?" Reaper asked, his voice steady. "I'm someone who knows a lot more about you than you'd like," the man replied, his lips curling into a faint smile. "And I think it's time you started facing the consequences of the choices you made." Reaper's heart raced. He had heard those words before. They were a reminder of the things he had done, the things he had tried to forget. "What do you want from me?" Reaper asked, his grip tightening around the knife. The man took a step forward, his presence imposing. "I don't want anything from you," he said. "But I think it's time you started paying for the debts you owe." Reaper tensed, the weight of the man's words sinking in. He didn't know what this was about, but something told him that whatever it wasn't going to end well. The man took another step closer, and this time, Reaper didn't back down. "You don't get to just walk away from everything, Reaper," the man continued. "The people you left behind, they've been waiting for you to come back. And now that you have, they're not going to let you slip away again." Reaper's breath caught in his throat. The weight of the man's words hit him like a punch to the gut. He knew exactly who the man was talking about. The brothers he had betrayed. The people he had hurt. It was all coming back to him now. The man took one last step forward, closing the gap between them. Reaper could feel the heat of the man's breath on his skin. "It's time to make things right," the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. Reaper's mind raced, trying to figure out what to do next. He could fight, but he knew that wouldn't solve anything. The man wasn't here to kill him. He was here to force him to face the past he had been running from for so long. Reaper's grip on the knife loosened as the realization hit him. He had nowhere to run anymore. The past had finally caught up with him, and there was no escaping it. The man stepped back, a smug smile on his face. "I'll be seeing you soon," he said before disappearing into the night. Reaper stood there for a long moment, the silence pressing in around him. His thoughts were spinning, and the weight of everything he had done felt unbearable. He had tried to leave this life behind, but now it seemed impossible. The debts, the people he had hurt, the mistakes he had made, they were all coming back to haunt him. With a heavy sigh, Reaper turned and walked back to his bike. He had no idea what the next step was, but he knew one thing for sure. The road ahead was going to be a hell of a lot harder than he had ever imagined. Reaper didn't know how long he stood there, staring into the darkness, the weight of the man's words sinking deeper with each passing second. It was as if the moment the man had spoken, a door had opened to a past he had spent years trying to shut. There was no running anymore. The past had caught up to him, and now he had to deal with the consequences. He climbed onto his bike, the engine roaring to life beneath him as he sped through the quiet streets. His mind was racing, trying to make sense of everything. The people he had left behind, the mistakes he had made, and now this new threat hanging over him. He had never thought of himself as a man of regret. The Hell's Angels had taught him to live in the moment, to take what you wanted and leave nothing behind. But now, the weight of his past actions was a constant reminder that no one truly escapes their mistakes. He had spent years living with the memory of what he had done, the blood he had spilled, and the people he had hurt. It was all part of the life he had chosen, the life he had thought he could outrun. But as he drove through the streets, the familiar rumble of his bike beneath him, he realized that he wasn't just running from his past anymore. He was being hunted by it. The streets blurred around him as he made his way toward an old, abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. He had no idea why he was going there, but something told him that this was where he needed to be. The warehouse had been a place of business back in the old days, a place where deals were made and secrets were kept. But now, it stood silent and decaying, a relic of a life that no longer existed. He parked his bike in front of the building and killed the engine, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he was expecting, But he knew he wasn't going to find answers by staying in the comfort of his own home. He had to face this head-on. As he stepped off his bike, the door to the warehouse creaked open, and a shadow stepped out. Reaper's hand instinctively went to the knife tucked in his belt, but he quickly relaxed when he saw who it was. It was a woman, tall and confident, with a look that could freeze anyone in their tracks. She stepped into the light, her leather jacket gleaming under the faint moonlight. "I knew you'd come," she said, her voice low and steady. Reaper didn't say anything, his eyes scanning her face. "You've been keeping your distance for too long," she continued, her eyes narrowing. "You've been running from your past, but it's still here. It's always been here." Reaper took a step forward, his gaze hardening. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cold. The woman smirked, clearly enjoying the tension between them. "I don't want anything," she said. "But I think it's time you started answering some questions. You can't keep hiding from this forever." Reaper clenched his fists, the anger rising within him. "I'm not hiding," he growled. "I'm just trying to move on." She shook her head, a small laugh escaping her lips. "Move on," she repeated, her tone filled with disbelief. "You think you can just walk away from this? From the things you've done? From the people you've hurt?" Reaper stepped closer, his jaw clenched. "I don't need you to remind me of my mistakes," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The woman didn't flinch. "You're right," she said, her voice suddenly serious. "You don't need me to remind you. But the people you owe? They're the ones who are going to remind you. And they won't be as kind as I am." Reaper's mind spun with the implications of her words. He had known this moment would come eventually, but he hadn't expected it to be like this. He thought he could control it, control his own fate, but now he saw that the past had a way of catching up to you, no matter how hard you tried to outrun it. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman stepped forward, her eyes locking onto his. "I want you to come back," she said. "I want you to face what you've done. You can't keep running forever." Reaper felt a pit form in his stomach. Coming back meant facing the Hell's Angels, the men he had once called brothers. It meant confronting the violence, the bloodshed, and the betrayal that had defined his life. "I'm not going back," he said firmly. "I'm not going back to that life." She smiled faintly, as if she had expected that response. "You don't have a choice," she said. "The people you left behind, they're coming for you. And you're not going to be able to hide forever." Reaper's mind was a blur as he processed her words. He had always known the consequences of his actions, but hearing it from her, seeing the certainty in her eyes, made it real. The past was no longer something he could escape. It was something he had to face. "If I go back," he said, his voice steady, "I'll be a target. I'll be dead before I even get there." She didn't flinch. "Not if you do it right," she said. "You've been running for too long, Reaper. It's time to stop running. Time to face the music." Reaper stood there, his mind racing. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing. He couldn't keep running from his past. The people who had been left behind were coming, and there was nowhere to hide. Not anymore. Reaper stood in the darkened alley, the wind biting at his face as the woman's words echoed in his mind. "Not if you do it right." She had said that as though it was that simple. But nothing in his life had ever been simple. He had been running for so long, buried under the weight of his past, the mistakes, the betrayals. Now, it felt like the universe had decided it was time for him to face everything he had been trying to escape. He couldn't run anymore. The people he had left behind, the ones who had once been his brothers in arms, were coming for him. They wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted, until they made him pay for what he had done. And Reaper knew, deep down, that no matter how far he ran, there was no place far enough. He wasn't sure what he was supposed to do, but something in his gut told him he had to take control of this. He had to stop being the victim of his own story. He had to take the reins. With a heavy heart, he walked back to his bike, the familiar hum of the engine grounding him, giving him a sense of purpose. The streets stretched out before him like an open road, but this time, it wasn't a road he could just ride away from. He needed to figure out what the next step was, and he knew it wasn't going to be easy. The night was still and quiet, the only sound the steady rhythm of his tires on the asphalt as he made his way to the old warehouse where he knew answers awaited him. The past wasn't just something that stayed behind. It was alive, breathing, and pulling him back into its grip. And now, he had no choice but to confront it head-on. The warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette dark and menacing in the moonlight. Reaper parked his bike outside, the harsh streetlight casting long shadows across the broken pavement. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever was waiting inside. As he approached the door, it creaked open on its own, as if it had been expecting him. The air inside smelled stale, a mixture of dust and the faint odor of something long forgotten. He stepped inside, his boots echoing in the silence, and his eyes adjusted to the dim light. The space was vast, filled with old crates and forgotten furniture. In the center of the room, a single table stood, its surface cluttered with papers, photographs, and a few scattered objects. He wasn't alone. The woman who had led him here was standing by the table, her back to him, her silhouette framed by the faint light filtering through the broken windows. "You found it," she said without turning around. Reaper didn't respond. His eyes scanned the room, taking in the scene before him. He could feel the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. "What is this?" he finally asked, his voice rough. "This is where it all started," the woman replied, turning to face him. Her eyes were hard, as if she had seen too much, known too much. "And it's where it will end." Reaper stepped closer to the table, his gaze falling on the photographs scattered across its surface. Some were of him, young, smiling, a man full of potential and promise. Others were of people he didn't recognize, faces that seemed to be linked to a part of his past he had long tried to forget. But the photograph in the center caught his attention. It was a picture of a man, older than him, wearing a Hell's Angels vest, standing in front of a building that looked all too familiar. The man was smiling, but there was something about the way he looked at the camera, a look that seemed to say he knew something Reaper didn't. "Who is this?" Reaper asked, his voice steady now. The woman walked up behind him, her hand resting on the edge of the table as she leaned in to look at the photo. "That's your father," she said quietly. Reaper's heart skipped a beat. His father, the man he had never known, the man whose name had always been spoken with a mixture of fear and respect, the man who had disappeared from his life long before he could remember. "I don't have a father," Reaper muttered, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. The woman's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "Yes, you do. He's the one who got you into this life. And now it's time for you to finish what he started." Reaper stared at the photo, the weight of the words sinking in. The man in the picture was his father, but how? How could this be possible? The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't make any sense. "I didn't ask for this," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I didn't ask for any of it." The woman's expression hardened again. "You don't get to choose, Reaper. This is your legacy. This is what you're born into. You can't escape it. You can only face it." He clenched his fists, the anger rising inside him like a tide. "I've already faced it. I've done my time. I've paid for my mistakes." She stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his. "Your father paid for his mistakes too, but his debt isn't settled, and neither is yours." Reaper's mind was spinning. His father, the Hell's Angels, the legacy of violence, the betrayal. It was all coming back to him now. The woman wasn't just a messenger. She was someone with answers, answers he didn't want but needed. "What do you want me to do?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She reached for one of the photographs, turning it so he could see it clearly. "You're going to find him. You're going to face your past, and you're going to end this once and for all." Reaper's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to face the man he had never known. But something deep inside him knew this was his only choice. The past was waiting for him, and he couldn't run from it anymore. "All right," he said, his voice steady. "I'll find him." Reaper walked out of the warehouse, his boots heavy on the cracked pavement as the weight of what he had just learned settled on him. His mind was still spinning, the photo of his father burning in his thoughts. The woman's words echoed in his ears. "You're going to find him. You're going to face your past, and you're going to end this once and for all." He had never expected this, never imagined that his past would come for him like this. His father, the Hell's Angels, everything he had tried to leave behind, it was all connected. He needed answers. The feeling of being hunted, of being pulled into something far bigger than himself, gnawed at him. There was no turning back. His father, the man who had been a shadow in his life, was no longer a ghost. The woman had said he owed a debt. What kind of debt could a man like him owe, and what had it to do with Reaper? He didn't know yet, but he was going to find out. He didn't have a plan, no map to guide him, just a gut feeling telling him that the road ahead was going to be dangerous. He had thought running was the answer, but now he realized it was only a temporary fix. The past always had a way of catching up. He started his bike, the familiar roar of the engine a reminder of a life he had known too well. The night was cold, and the streets were empty, but as he rode, his thoughts turned to the people he had left behind. His brothers, the men he had once called family, the ones who had taught him everything he knew. They had been ruthless, loyal, and they had all shared a code. But Reaper had broken that code. He had walked away, thinking he could find redemption, thinking he could outrun the consequences. Now he wasn't so sure. He needed to find out where his father had gone, what he had done, and why it all mattered now. The woman had said the debt wasn't paid. But what was it? Reaper pushed the throttle harder, the wind rushing past him, the cold air biting into his face. His headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the path ahead, but it all felt like a blur. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he knew he had to keep moving. The answer lay somewhere in the shadows of his past, and he had to find it before it found him. As he drove, he thought about the people who had been part of his life. The Hells Angels were a brotherhood, a family built on loyalty and fear. But for Reaper, that family had been broken long ago. When he left, he thought he was leaving behind the chaos, the violence. But now, it felt like it was all coming back to him, like the past had never really been left behind. His mind flashed back to the old days, the smell of gasoline, the roar of engines, the laughter and the violence that came with it. The thrill of the ride, the power of the club. But with it came the betrayal, the fear, the people who had fallen because of the choices they made. Reaper had seen it all, and he had been a part of it. And now, it was time to face the consequences. He had no idea where to start, but he knew he had to find something. Someone. His father. The road stretched on, endless and empty, but it was a road he had no choice but to follow. Reaper wasn't afraid of the road ahead. What scared him was what he would find when he got there. The shadows of his past were closing in, and he couldn't outrun them. Not this time. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, had begun to creep in. He could feel it on the back of his neck, the way the silence seemed too loud, too oppressive. He wasn't alone. He could sense it. Someone was out there, watching him. He turned a corner and pulled into a small gas station. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a sickly glow over the place. He stopped in front of a pump, his hands gripping the handlebars tightly. His gut told him to be cautious, but he was too far in now. He needed answers, and he couldn't let fear stop him. He glanced around, but the gas station was quiet. Too quiet. The air felt thick, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He filled up his bike, keeping his eyes on the street, scanning for any movement. Nothing. As he finished, he wiped his hands on his jacket and started to pull away when he saw a figure in the shadows, just beyond the dim light of the station. It was a man, tall, with a heavy jacket that looked familiar. Reaper's heart skipped a beat. "You're looking for answers, aren't you?" the man said, his voice low and gruff, like it was something he had said 1,000 times. Reaper stopped, his fingers tightening on the throttle. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice calm but steady. The man stepped closer, his face coming into the light. It was someone from his past, one of the old crew. But his name? Reaper couldn't place it. "I've been watching you," the man continued. "You think you can just walk away from everything. But it's not that easy." Reaper's pulse quickened, his instincts flaring. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was someone who knew too much. "What do you want?" Reaper asked, his voice edged with suspicion. "I want you to remember," the man said, stepping into the light completely. "I want you to remember who you are, who your father was. The debt's not just yours to pay." Reaper's mind raced, but he couldn't find the words. The man's words were like a hammer, hitting him with the truth he had tried so hard to ignore. The past was here, and there was no running anymore. Reaper stood frozen in place, his breath shallow, his heart pounding in his chest. The man in front of him was a ghost from the past, someone he hadn't seen in years but knew all too well. The old crew, the Hells Angels, had been his family, his brothers. But now, they were nothing more than a reminder of everything he had tried to escape. He had walked away from them, from that life, thinking it would bring him peace. But now, it seemed like that peace was only an illusion. "I've been watching you," the man said again, his voice like gravel scraping against metal. "You thought you could run, but you can't outrun the things you've done." Reaper didn't speak. He didn't know what to say. This man knew him too well, knew the darkness that still clung to him. His eyes narrowed as he tried to place the name, but the years of separation had blurred the memories. The man was wearing the same weathered leather jacket that marked him as one of the old crew, the familiar patches that brought back a flood of memories. The man took a step closer, his eyes hard and calculating. "You're not the same man you were, Reaper," he said, his voice low. "You've been hiding, but you can't keep running from what's coming." Reaper's fists clenched at his sides. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice tinged with anger. The man smirked, as if he had been waiting for that question. "Your father's debts," he said, his words hanging in the air. Reaper's mind spun as the words hit him like a punch to the gut. His father, the man who had disappeared from his life years ago, leaving nothing but silence in his wake. But now, it seemed like that silence was over. "What debts?" Reaper asked, his voice tight, the anger bubbling beneath the surface. The man's eyes flickered with something that resembled pity, but it quickly faded. "The kind of debts that never go away," he said. "The kind that follow you, no matter how far you run. The kind you're going to have to pay." Reaper took a step forward, his jaw clenched. "I'm not my father," he said, his voice low but steady. "I didn't ask for any of this." The man chuckled darkly. "Doesn't matter if you asked for it or not," he said. "It's part of who you are now. You can't escape that." Reaper shook his head, his mind racing. "I've already paid," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "I walked away. I left all of that behind." The man's gaze hardened, his smile fading into something more sinister. "You can't walk away from the Hell's Angels," he said, his voice cold. "Not without paying the price. And that price is coming due." Reaper stood there, feeling the weight of the man's words pressing down on him. He had tried to leave it all behind, to move forward, but now it felt like the past was pulling him back in, dragging him under. "What do you want from me?" Reaper asked, his voice quiet, but with an edge of desperation. The man stepped closer, his breath heavy with the promise of something dangerous. "I want you to face your past," he said, his voice harsh. "I want you to face the debts your father left behind. And I want you to make it right." Reaper's fists tightened, the anger inside him rising like a wave. "How the hell am I supposed to do that?" he asked, his voice cracking with frustration. The man's eyes flashed with something, satisfaction, maybe, or pity. It was hard to tell. "I'll help you," he said. "But you have to do the work. You have to make things right, or it'll never end." Reaper took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He didn't know how to fix this, how to make things right, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't keep running. The past had already found him, and now it was time to face it. "What's the first step?" Reaper asked, his voice strained. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to Reaper. "This will get you started," he said. "Inside, you'll find the name of someone who can help you. You don't have much time. The clock's already ticking." Reaper took the envelope, his fingers brushing against the cold paper. He had no idea what was inside, but he knew it was the key to everything. His heart was racing, his mind whirling with the uncertainty of what lay ahead. "This isn't over," the man said, his voice low. "Not by a long shot." Reaper nodded, the reality of what was coming crashing down on him. "I know," he muttered, "but it's time to end it." He turned away, his mind already on the next move. The man's voice stopped him just as he was about to walk away. "Remember, Reaper," he said, his voice sharp. "You can't hide forever. The past always catches up with you." Reaper didn't look back. He didn't need to. The weight of those words settled in his chest, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was finally on the edge of something that could give him the redemption he had been seeking. He had to face his father's debts, face the Hell's Angels, and face the man he used to be. There was no turning back now. Reaper stood in the dim light of the gas station, the envelope still clenched in his hand. He had left the man standing in the alley, the words echoing in his mind. But now, there was no time to linger. The road ahead was clear, but he had no idea where it would take him. The past, however, was never far behind. He opened the envelope with a sense of unease. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its surface marked with a name and an address. He recognized neither, but he didn't need to. The man had given him the key to move forward, and it was now up to Reaper to decide how far he was willing to go. He folded the paper carefully and shoved it into his jacket pocket, glancing around once more. The gas station was silent, too silent. He could feel eyes on him, but when he looked around, there was no one in sight. He shook off the feeling, climbing back onto his bike. The engine roared to life, and with a steady hand, he twisted the throttle. The night air cut sharply against his face as he sped down the empty road. The name on the paper gnawed at him, but he had no time for hesitation. His thoughts were clouded with 1,000 possibilities, none of them promising anything good. He couldn't afford to look back. As the miles stretched before him, his mind wandered to the Hell's Angels again. His brothers. He had left them behind, but they had never truly left him. Their presence had lingered in the back of his mind, haunting him even in the most mundane moments. It was a bond that never truly broke, no matter how far you ran. He had been living in the shadow of their expectations, their code, and now it was clear he was going to have to face them again. There was no escaping that. Reaper turned off the highway and followed a smaller, less traveled road that wound through dense trees. The air grew cooler, and the sound of his bike was swallowed by the surrounding woods. He didn't know why he was heading this way, but the name on the paper felt like it was guiding him. The streetlights became fewer, the landscape growing darker as he drove deeper into the unknown. Eventually, he pulled up to a rusted gate, its iron bars twisted and worn by time. The name on the paper matched the sign on the gate, a small, faded logo that once belonged to a motorcycle club. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he approached. This place was no longer what it had been. Everything here had been abandoned, left to rot in the past. Reaper parked his bike, his boots crunching on the gravel as he approached the gate. The heavy silence surrounded him, but he didn't hesitate. He was here now, and there was no turning back. He pushed open the gate with a creak and stepped inside. The old clubhouse loomed in front of him, its windows dark and vacant. He hadn't been here in years, not since the night he walked away from everything he had ever known. The place felt dead now, its former vibrancy long gone. He took a deep breath and walked toward the door, the weight of everything pressing down on him. When he reached the door, he knocked. The sound echoed in the emptiness, and for a moment, he wondered if anyone would answer. But then the door creaked open slowly, and a familiar face appeared in the doorway. It was one of his old brothers, someone he had thought he would never see again. The man's eyes flickered with recognition, but there was no warmth in his gaze, just cold indifference. "Reaper," he said, his voice gruff. "Thought you were done with this life." Reaper didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. The once familiar scent of oil and leather was gone, replaced by dust and decay. The place had been abandoned for too long, and now it felt like a ghost of what it had been. "I'm not done," Reaper said, his voice steady. "I've got business to finish." The man didn't say anything at first. He just stepped aside, letting Reaper enter. "You're a long way from home," the man muttered. Reaper ignored him, his eyes falling on the walls lined with old photographs and faded trophies. This place had meant everything to him once. But now, it was just a reminder of what he had left behind. He looked at the man, his gaze hardening. "I need to know what happened," Reaper said. "I need to know what my father did. Why I'm still paying for it." The man's expression hardened. He crossed the room and poured himself a drink, not offering Reaper any. "Your father made a lot of enemies," the man said slowly, his voice laced with contempt. "And you? You were just a kid, but you're the one who's still living with the consequences." Reaper clenched his fists at his sides. "I didn't ask for this," he growled. The man turned to face him, his eyes cold and calculating. "No one ever does. But it doesn't matter. The debts don't get erased, Reaper. They follow you until you pay them." Reaper took a step forward. "How do I make it right?" he asked, his voice thick with frustration. The man smirked. "You can't. Not all of it. But you can try. You can try to fix what's left." Reaper stood there, the weight of the words settling on him. His father's legacy wasn't something he could undo. The damage had been done, and all he could do now was try to make amends where he could. He didn't know how he was going to do it, but he knew he had no other choice. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. The man stared at him for a moment, then shook his head. "You're in deeper than you think, Reaper. But if you really want to fix this, you'll need to go to the source. Your father's old contacts. The ones he left behind. They're the ones who can help you now. But be warned, some of them won't be so forgiving." Reaper's gaze hardened. "I'm not afraid of them," he said, his voice low and resolute. The man smiled faintly. "You should be." Reaper's mind raced as he left the dilapidated warehouse, the weight of the man's words heavy on his chest. The past wasn't something you could just run from, and the debts that his father had racked up were now his to deal with. He had thought that leaving the Hell's Angels behind would free him from the darkness of that life, but it was clear now that nothing could erase the mark it had left on him. The man had told him to seek out his father's old contacts, but Reaper wasn't sure where to start. His father had been a shadow in his life, a figure he had only heard about through whispers. He knew the name, knew the reputation, but nothing more. The idea of going to the source, to the people his father had once worked with, made his stomach turn. These weren't just people, they were dangerous, ruthless. But the man had been clear. If he wanted answers, he had to go to them. No one else could help him now. The road ahead felt uncertain, but one thing was clear. He couldn't face this alone. He had spent too many years hiding, trying to bury the past. Now it was dragging him back, and there was no escape. He climbed onto his bike, the familiar roar of the engine a reminder that he wasn't done yet. The streets ahead were empty, the moonlight casting long shadows across the pavement as he sped toward the unknown. His thoughts were clouded with the uncertainty of what was to come. He wasn't afraid of the Hell's Angels. He knew how to handle them. It was the unknown that troubled him, the people his father had left behind, the ones who would remember him and the debts that had been left unpaid. Reaper knew the past had a way of coming back, but he never expected it to hit him like this. His grip tightened on the handlebars as he turned onto a darkened road that led him to the edge of town. The address the man had given him was a small house, tucked away in a neighborhood that had seen better days. He pulled up in front of the house, the silence of the street pressing in on him. The place looked abandoned, its paint chipped, the yard overgrown with weeds. But as Reaper walked up the cracked sidewalk, he felt a strange sense of familiarity. This was a place that had seen its share of secrets, a place where things were buried. He knocked on the door, the sound of his knuckles rapping against the wood echoing in the quiet night. For a long moment, there was no answer. Then, just as Reaper was about to turn away, the door creaked open, and a woman appeared. Her face was shadowed, but her eyes were sharp, sizing him up immediately. She didn't smile, didn't say a word. "I'm looking for someone," Reaper said, his voice steady, though he wasn't sure what he was expecting. The woman didn't speak right away, but she stepped aside and motioned for him to enter. Reaper hesitated for a moment, his instincts telling him to be cautious. But he didn't have time to be cautious. He needed answers, and this was the only lead he had. He stepped inside, the door shutting behind him with a soft thud. The house smelled musty, the air thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The woman led him into a small living room where old furniture lay in disarray, a fireplace long and used sitting in the corner. "Sit," she said, her voice low and commanding. Reaper didn't argue. He sat in the chair she indicated, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. The woman studied him for a moment before sitting across from him. "You're looking for your father's people, aren't you?" she asked. Reaper didn't answer right away. How did she know that? He had said nothing about his father. But then again, she knew more than she let on. "I'm here for answers," he said quietly. "I need to know what happened. Why am I still paying for his mistakes?" The woman nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. "Your father was a powerful man," she said. "But power comes with a price. And your father, well, he didn't pay his debts. He thought he could escape them, but they follow you, whether you like it or not." Reaper clenched his fists, his anger simmering beneath the surface. "I didn't ask for this," he muttered. "I never asked for any of it." The woman's gaze softened, but only for a moment. "None of us do," she replied. "But we all have to deal with the consequences." She stood up and walked over to a small table in the corner, pulling out a worn leather pouch. She opened it and pulled out a series of old photographs, their edges yellowed with age. She placed them in front of Reaper. "These are the people who were closest to your father," she said, her voice low. "The ones who knew everything. They're the ones who still owe him. And now, they're your problem." Reaper stared at the photographs. His father's old associates, the men and women who had once worked beside him, some of them looking familiar, others completely unknown. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What do you want me to do with these?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Find them," the woman said, her eyes locking with his. "Find them, and make them pay their debts." Reaper felt a chill run down his spine. He didn't know if he was ready for this, but he knew it was the only way. The past was not something you could escape. And now, It was time to face it. He picked up the photographs, his fingers brushing against the images of the people who had once been a part of his father's world. He had no idea how he was going to find them, or what he would do when he did, but he knew one thing. This was his last chance to put the ghosts of his past to rest. He stood up, the weight of the photographs heavy in his hands. "Where do I start?" he asked. The woman didn't answer immediately, but her eyes told him everything he needed to know. "Start at the beginning," she said softly. "Find them, and when you do, make them pay for everything." Reaper nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. The road ahead was uncertain, but there was no turning back now. He had to face his father's debts, and he had no idea how he was going to survive it. Reaper sat at the small, dimly lit table, the photos scattered in front of him like pieces of a puzzle he wasn't sure how to put together. Each face, each name, was a reminder of the life he had tried to leave behind. His father's world, his own world, and now the debts that hung over him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. The woman's words echoed in his mind. Find them and make them pay for everything. It sounded simple enough, but Reaper knew that nothing in his life had ever been simple. The past was a dangerous place to go, and he wasn't sure if he was prepared for what he might find. He picked up one of the photos, studying the face of a man he didn't recognize, a man who had clearly been a part of his father's world. The other photos were of similar people, men and women with hard eyes, cold stares, and a presence that spoke of power, danger, and loyalty to a code that had no room for mercy. He didn't know where to start. The names on the back of the photos didn't mean anything to him, and yet they were the key to everything. They were the ones who could explain the debts his father had left unpaid. He had to find them, but where? Reaper felt the weight of the photos in his hand, each one a piece of a life he had never fully known. His father had left him nothing but the remnants of his mistakes. He had walked away from it all, but now it seemed like he was being dragged back into it, forced to clean up the mess that had been made. The door behind him creaked open, and the woman entered, her footsteps light but purposeful. She stood there for a moment, watching him as he studied the photos. "Have you decided?" she asked quietly. Reaper didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure if he had decided anything. He wasn't even sure if he knew where to begin. But he had no choice. The debts were real, and they wouldn't just disappear. "I have to find them," he said, finally meeting her gaze. "But I don't know where to start." She nodded, her face unreadable. "Start with what you know," she said. "Your father wasn't just anyone. He had contacts, people who owed him, people who will still remember him." Reaper frowned. "But they don't know me." She smiled faintly, the hint of a knowing look in her eyes. "No, but they will know you. And if they don't, they'll know your father's name, and that will be enough." Reaper let the words sink in. He wasn't sure how much he believed, but it was the only lead he had. He had to find these people, confront them, and somehow make things right. "What if they don't want to talk to me?" he asked. "What if they don't care?" The woman's gaze hardened. "They'll care. They'll care when they realize what they owe. And they'll care when they see that you're not the same kid you used to be. You've been running, Reaper, but now it's time to stop." He nodded, a sense of resolve settling in his chest. He didn't know how, but he would find a way to make this right. He had to. The road ahead was uncertain, but he had no other choice. He would follow the trail left by his father, even if it meant facing people who would just as soon see him dead. The woman took a step back, her eyes still on him. "I'm not going to hold your hand through this," she said. "You're on your own now. But remember this. You make your choices, and you face the consequences. That's how it works." Reaper stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. It was time to go. The weight of the past, the debts that had followed him, all of it would have to be faced. He didn't know what he was walking into, but there was no turning back now. He had to find the people in those photos, confront the past, and hope he could come out of it alive. "I'll find them," he said, his voice steady. "And I'll make them pay for everything." The woman didn't say anything else. She simply turned and walked toward the door. Reaper followed her out, stepping into the cold night air. His bike was waiting for him, the familiar hum of the engine offering a sense of comfort. But as he started it up, the familiar sound of the engine only reminded him of how far gone everything had become. His past wasn't something he could outrun anymore. It was chasing him, and it wasn't going to stop until he faced it. He took off down the road, the wind whipping past him as he made his way toward the unknown. The pictures, the names, the faces of people who had been a part of his father's life. They were the only clue he had. But they were more than just clues. They were the pieces of a puzzle he couldn't ignore. He had to find them, and he had to make things right. The road ahead was long, and it would take him to places he never thought he would go. But Reaper knew one thing for sure. The journey had begun, and there was no going back. Reaper's tires screeched as he cut through the deserted highway, the wind slapping against his face like 1,000 sharp needles. The road was endless, stretching on for miles, but it didn't matter. He had no destination, no real plan, just the burning need to find the answers, to face what he had been running from for years. The names on the photographs, the faces of people he didn't know, were haunting him. The woman had told him to start with them, but there was no instruction manual for this. His past, his father's past, was coming for him, and there was no outrunning it this time. The dim light of the moon barely illuminated the road ahead, but Reaper didn't slow down. His heart pounded in his chest as he thought of what he might find, of who he might find. The world he had once been a part of was dark and twisted, and it wasn't something that could be fixed easily. He could feel it in his gut. The things he had done, the things his father had done, would come back to bite him. There was no escape. He didn't know how much longer he could keep pretending that the past was behind him. The sound of the engine beneath him became a steady hum, but his mind raced in 1,000 directions. He had been told to find the people his father had left behind. But how? Where were they? How could he possibly confront them after all these years? The weight of it all felt unbearable. But just as the thought threatened to consume him, the glow of a small diner appeared in the distance, its neon sign flickering in the night. Reaper's instincts told him to stop, to take a moment, to gather himself. The diner was an oasis in the vast nothingness of the desert, a brief respite before the storm. He pulled up to the parking lot, his bike's tires crunching against the gravel. The dim light from the diner spilled out into the dark, casting long shadows on the ground. Reaper took a deep breath before dismounting. He needed a moment, but more than that, he needed a lead. He didn't know what to expect when he walked through the door, but he had learned long ago that places like this often had information, or people, he could use. As he stepped inside, the warmth of the diner hit him, a stark contrast to the cold, open road outside. The air smelled faintly of coffee and grease, and the low hum of conversation filled the space. A few truckers sat at the counter, their voices low and murmuring, while a waitress wiped down a table in the corner. She looked up as he entered, her gaze flickering over him for just a moment before she offered a small smile. "What can I get you?" she asked, her voice kind but detached. Reaper paused for a moment, his mind focused on the task at hand. "I'm looking for someone," he said, his voice rough. "Someone who might know something about the Hells Angels." The waitress's smile faltered slightly, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. She studied him for a moment before nodding. "I know a few people who might know something. But you're going to have to talk to Roy," she said, nodding toward a booth in the back. "He's been around for years. Used to run with a few of them. Might be able to help you." Reaper didn't hesitate. He thanked the waitress, his gaze fixed on the booth she had pointed to. The man sitting there was older, his hair graying and his face weathered by time. He was dressed in a faded leather jacket that still had the remnants of patches on it, and he looked up as Reaper approached. The man's eyes narrowed as he took in Reaper's appearance, but he didn't say anything at first. Reaper sat down across from him, his eyes locked on the older man. "I need to talk to you," Reaper said, his voice low and steady. "I'm looking for answers about my father. About the Hells Angels." Roy took a long drag from his cigarette, exhaling slowly as he looked Reaper over. "Your father, huh?" he muttered, his voice rough from years of smoke and booze. "What's it to you?" Reaper didn't flinch. "He was a member. I need to know what happened. Why I'm still paying for his mistakes." Roy's gaze softened for a moment, a flicker of something, pity, maybe, crossing his face. "Your father was a hell of a man," he said quietly, "but he made a lot of enemies. And those enemies? They don't forget." Reaper's chest tightened. "I need to know where to start. I don't have time to waste." Roy leaned back in the booth, his hand resting on his drink. "You're asking the wrong questions," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "It's not about starting, kid. It's about finishing." Reaper leaned forward, the urgency in his voice now matching the fire in his chest. "What do you mean?" Roy exhaled slowly, the smoke swirling around his head as he took another drag from his cigarette. "Your father owed a debt, a big one. And when he died, He didn't just leave behind the people who loved him. He left behind the ones who wanted him dead. The ones who think the debt's still unpaid. And those people? They're coming for you. Reaper's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about survival. It was about facing the legacy his father had left behind, and the consequences of it. Where are they? Reaper demanded. I need to know who they are. Roy flicked his cigarette into the ashtray and gave Reaper a long, searching look. You're not ready, he said, his voice low. But if you're dead set on this, you'll find them. Just know this. Once you start this, there's no turning back. They'll know you're coming. Reaper stood up, the weight of Roy's words sinking in. I'm ready, he said, his voice firm. I have to be. Roy's eyes followed him as he walked out of the diner, the weight of the truth settling in his chest. Reaper didn't know what awaited him, but he knew one thing. The path ahead would be paved with blood, and there was no turning back now. Reaper walked out of the diner, his boots heavy against the pavement, the weight of Roy's words still lingering in the back of his mind. The man had been right. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about survival. It was about facing the consequences of his father's debts that had long been left unpaid. But the more Reaper thought about it, the more he knew that there was no other choice. He couldn't go back to the life he had tried to leave behind. He wasn't that man anymore. Or at least, he didn't want to be. But the past had a way of pulling you back, no matter how far you tried to run. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. He could feel the weight of it now, the danger that was closing in, the enemies that were waiting for him. The Hell's Angels, the people his father had dealt with, they were out there somewhere, and they were coming for him. And Reaper knew that if he didn't confront them now, it would be the end of him. He climbed onto his bike, the engine roaring to life beneath him as he sped down the road. The desert stretched on for miles, the only sound the hum of the engine beneath him. The open road had always been his escape, his sanctuary, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, it felt like the road was closing in, like there was no place left to run. His thoughts raced as the miles flew by. The woman in the diner had told him to find his father's old contacts. But what if they didn't want to help? What if they wanted to finish what had been started all those years ago? Reaper shook his head, pushing the thought aside. He couldn't afford to think like that. He needed to focus. He needed to find the people his father had left behind and figure out how to make things right. He didn't know how, but he had to try. The headlights of his bike cut through the darkness, illuminating the road ahead. He had no idea where he was going, but he knew one thing. The journey wasn't going to be easy. But Reaper wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The past had caught up with him, and now it was time to face it. He passed through small towns, empty highways, and desolate stretches of land. The silence around him was deafening, broken only by the rumble of his bike and the occasional gust of wind. His mind kept going back to the photographs, to the faces of people he didn't know, but who were tied to his father's world. He had to find them. He had to face them. And when he did, he knew there would be no turning back. It wasn't until he reached the outskirts of a small, run-down town that he slowed down. He had been driving for hours, the road stretching on, but something about this place felt right. Something about it felt like a place he could find answers. He parked his bike outside an old motel, the neon sign flickering weakly in the night. The place looked as though it had seen better days, its windows cracked, the paint peeling from the walls. Reaper took a deep breath before dismounting and walking toward the door. The bell above the entrance jingled as he pushed it open, and the smell of stale cigarette smoke hit him immediately. The lobby was dimly lit, the only sound the soft hum of a ceiling fan. Behind the counter, a man in his 50s sat slouched in a chair, his eyes half closed. He looked up as Reaper approached, his expression unreadable. "What can I do for you?" the man asked, his voice gruff. Reaper didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned against the counter, his eyes scanning the room. "I'm looking for someone," he said quietly. "Someone who used to run with my father." The man's eyes narrowed, and Reaper could feel the tension building in the air. "Your father?" the man repeated, his voice thick with suspicion. Reaper nodded slowly. "Yeah, he was a member of the Hell's Angels. I need to find someone who knew him, someone who can help me." The man sat up straighter, his gaze hardening. "You don't want to mess with that, kid," he warned, his voice low. "The Hell's Angels aren't a group you just walk away from. And neither are the people they left behind." Reaper clenched his fists, the anger bubbling to the surface. "I didn't walk away from anything. My father left me nothing but a mess." I need to clean it up. The man stared at him for a moment, as if deciding whether to help or not. Finally, he let out a sigh and reached under the counter. I've got a name for you, he said, pulling out a scrap of paper and scribbling something on it. But I'm warning you, kid. You go looking for him. You better be ready for what's coming. Reaper grabbed the paper, his fingers shaking slightly as he read the name written on it. It meant nothing to him, but he knew this was his next step. This was the lead he had been looking for. Thank you, Reaper said, his voice steady now, the weight of his mission settling in. The man didn't respond, just nodded and went back to his slouched position. Reaper turned and walked out of the motel, his mind focused on the name in his hand. He knew this was the beginning of something he couldn't control, something that would lead him deeper into his father's world. But no matter the cost, he had to see this through. He had no choice. As he mounted his bike and sped off into the night, the road ahead was still uncertain, but one thing was clear. The past wasn't going to let him go, and it was time to face the music. In this thrilling Hell Angels story, Reaper embarks on a dangerous journey to face his past, uncovering the hidden truths of his father's life and the debts left unpaid. The path he takes is filled with danger, betrayal, and relentless enemies from the world of Hell Angels. As he uncovers secrets buried deep in the shadows, he must confront the people his father once worked with, people who still remember his name and the debts that remain unsettled. This Hell Angel story shows the consequences of running from the past and the inevitable clash with those who will stop at nothing to collect what is owed. As Reaper follows the trail of his father's old associates, he finds himself in a race against time, determined to make things right before it's too late. The world of Hell Angels is not one that lets go easily, and Reaper must fight to survive in this ruthless underworld, filled with suspense, danger, and the pursuit of redemption. This Hell Angel story will leave you hooked until the very end. With each step, Reaper gets closer to facing the ghosts of his past and making the ultimate choice about his future, all while navigating the brutal reality of Hell Angels stories that continue to haunt him. If you love gripping Hell Angels stories filled with action and emotional depth, this tale is one you won't want to miss.